Jim here, and I thought since it's getting warmer and plants are getting a lot greener and the animals have been a lot more active, that we could do an outdoor activity today. And so we're going to focus on the topic of populations. And so a population is a group of individuals. So for an example, maybe the species that we're thinking of, that group is Nubian goats. I've been missing the farm recently, so we're going to use that as our example. And maybe we want to study the population of Nubian goats in an area, right? So we'll think about how many Nubian goats are on Earth. Wow, that's probably a big number, right? Well, let's shrink that down. We could study the population, how many individuals are in North America or even just the United States. We could think about maybe even a smaller area. Let's think about how many Nubian goats there are in New Hampshire. Or maybe just how many Nubian goats there are at Remick Museum and Farm. So that would be the total population there. And then we could break that up and think about how many different types of Nubian goats there are in that population, young goats or older goats, but there are lots of different things we could study. Now, we're going to think about things that are a little bit more wild as far as animals and plants today. We can usually a little easier study of humans or animals on the farm because we can know where they're at, but you can imagine a research scientist thinking about endangered species or finding a new place. They would want to get an accurate count of how many of those things there are there. And so if they were studying something like a red oak in a giant forest, wow, that would take a long time to count all those trees. It might not even be possible. And so scientists that are studying these populations of different species, they need to be able to figure out the population without having to count everything. So they might estimate. And even if they're estimating, though, they want to be as accurate as they can. And so they use some what we call sampling methods that help them estimate. And these methods can be what our activity is going to be today because they're a lot of fun and they also help us just focus in on some areas so that we don't miss little small things and cool things that might just be in our backyard. So for this activity, we'll learn a little bit about some of these different methods. They'll help us build some skills in these areas, even if we're just introducing ourselves to them. And we can explore those little areas that we have available to us right now, even if it's just our backyard. We can look at some sampling for populations. Okay, so I'm going to use this as our model to kind of help us show what we're going to do outside. And for our sampling techniques today, what we're going to be thinking about are things that don't move around a lot. So plants, very small animals. If I try to sample birds or deer in this way, they just happen to move around too much. So let's think about this being a forest. And for my model today, I'm only thinking about one species. Maybe we're looking at specific trees. And so I only want to look at white, or we call them paper birches, and those are represented by the green square. So these little green squares, every one square is a paper birch. And so again, it would take me a long time to go around and count each one of these green squares. So we're going to use what's called a quadrat. Basically, it's a little square, and it's going to help us estimate how many of these green squares there are in this total area. So if I just randomly place this out there, I would then be able to count how many green squares there are. And my little square happens to be a 1-inch square, so it's 1 inch on all sides on the inside there. And so now maybe I have 25 green squares in there. I know my area of my quadrant. I know the area of my forest, and I could use that to estimate how many green trees there would be in that total area. Now, that wouldn't be very accurate. I only took one plot study there, and maybe there's a whole bunch of birch trees right in that little square, and then there's not very many in the rest of the area. Or the opposite, right? Maybe there's only 1 or 2 birch trees right here, but then there's a whole bunch around in the other places. So what I would want to do is try and take as many different samples as I could to get more accurate numbers, right? And I could average out my numbers and still figure that out on the area. Now, the other method that we can use is what's called a line transect. And I've just got some zip tie, or not zip ties, but some twist ties here. So whatever I've got laying around the apartment. And I basically would just lay out this line transect, and similarly, we're looking just for the green squares. So I would just count where those green squares touch my line, right? So however many of those, and I would count those and think about that number. And again, I would want to do as many samples as I can to have as much accuracy as possible. So we're going to think about how we can do this outside. Okay, so we don't need much for this activity, which is great. You can see I have some pretty limited things here. I don't have a lot of stuff available right now to me, which is okay. And also we can make this activity pretty simple or a lot more complex, depending on the age of our learners and how much math and things that we want to incorporate. Really, if we're just looking at our little areas here, it's just a really good way to focus on one area and not overlook some of the smaller things that we have, maybe in our yard or in that little forest area that we have. So it's really just a nice way to focus, but we can also really think about populations and how many things are living and thinking about that as a science project. And so, again, very simple materials. I've got my notebook and pen, always important for observations. I do want to take some field guides out with me, so if I don't know something, I can look it up. Again, if you don't want to be that complex with things, you can just write down, different types of grass or different wildflowers and describe them. That's okay too. I have just some little bit of rope here for my line transect. And I cut out a little square. This is a 10 centimeter square out of just some paperboard I had laying around. Ideally, you'd want your quadrat to be bigger, maybe like a meter square. You could use like PVC pipe or yardsticks or anything like that. But mine's about 10 centimeters. So this is what's going to have to do for me for today. But again, not much material-wise, which is great. So now we get to go have our fun and go outside. All right, so we have our little quadrant out here, and what we can do is think about those different individual species that might be in there. So if I wanted to count maybe just grass, I would count each different one, or there's some clover, different types of things that might be there. I could also just use this to focus my attention in a really small area, so I can think about those different things that are there. All the different species. I've got some, some taller growing things. I've got some moss. I got probably some clover. I found a little maple seed in here. So there's a lot of different ways you can think about it. The diversity of it, how many different species there are, how many of one species there are, however you want to make this look. But then I could take this quadrant and take a number of different samples from all over the yard, and if I wanted to, I could measure my area of the yard and see if I could estimate how many things are there. All right, so our line transect is essentially doing the same thing with just in a different method. And so we're going to look where the line intersects with different plants, so where they're touching. We could also measure a specific space around that. If you wanted to do like 3 inches from each side, that would be fine, however you're setting it up. We would want this to be, some sort of length. Usually, again, out in the field, be like 15 meters long, but you can do any length that you want to. Maybe you want to count individual plants like this large thing here at the end, or maybe, again, you want to look at diversity, so total species. All right, so that's our activity for the day. I hope everyone enjoyed and is a little inspired to get out, even just in your front and backyard, just to go see if you can focus on populations and see what's out there. There's, even in a small area, there's often a lot of cool stuff. And so again, if you're following on YouTube, make sure you like and subscribe so you can keep up to date with all of our new videos. If you're following on Facebook, give us a like, and everyone have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.